More on this, I'm joined by Perrin, a professor of law at the University of British Columbia and author of Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, joining me today from Vancouver. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Do you think this is a good experiment to run?
I think we have come to a point where this is the only option. I used to be the top criminal justice advisor to Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. I never would have thought I'd be on the BBC saying we need to decriminalize people who use drugs, but here I am. There were 27,000 Canadians who died in the last 5 years of overdoses. These are from illicit, contaminated street drugs. In my province of British Columbia, we now have more deaths from overdose than suicide, homicide, car accidents, and accidental pharmaceutical overdoses combined. So we've come to a point where we know punishing people with addictions does not work. It makes it worse. And we have to treat them with compassion and help them to get support for treatment and recovery.
Won't parents be really frightened that their children are now going to try very dangerous chemicals because they are legally allowed to, and more people will be drawn into this?
You'd think that. I mean, that was my thought. I have 3 young children. What the research has found and what our tragic experiences in BC is kids are already experimenting with drugs. 50 years of campaigns to try to scare them straight or threaten them with jail time has backfired. In fact, those programs were found to increase children's interest in using drugs. In BC, with criminalized drugs, what we see are that children as young as 11 years old have overdosed and died. And so we have a contaminated street drug supply with synthetic opioids like fentanyl and carfentanil, which are 100 times more powerful than naturally occurring things like heroin. And they are in every street drug we have imaginable. So this is part of a new approach, which says if you're going to use drugs, if you have an addiction, we are going to support you and try to keep you alive and get into treatment, rather than saying go on the street and roll the dice. The other thing we found is that people who are incarcerated in Canada for drug crimes and then released are essentially, it's a death sentence. They're 50 times more likely to overdose and die because their tolerance has gone down while incarcerated. So this is something where Canada is coming out of the fog of the global drug war, taking its first tentative steps. And I firmly believe this is a step that other countries can and should take as well.
But is the point here that you supply safer drugs, or that people are not frightened to go and ask for help if they get into trouble? Is that the point of this?
Exactly. Where I live in Vancouver, I'm 10 minutes from Vancouver's downtown east side, called the poorest postal code in Canada. I can get in my car, drive down there, and purchase contaminated street drugs. I'll have no idea what's in them. I'll have no problem doing that. I would have to search for probably weeks to find unpasteurized milk in an area that's an agricultural area. And so when we regulate things, there's quality control around them. When we allow organized crime to create drugs that are used by people who are going to use anyway, it is playing Russian roulette. And so that's what we have found. This is not something that we expected to find, but cracking down on people who use drugs, looked at some of the reasons why. Early childhood trauma, one of the leading reasons why people turn to substances. In our research, we found people as young as 11, 12, 13 years old using hard street drugs. And again, at those ages, dying of overdose. So we need to start treating people with compassion. The other thing I should mention is Indigenous peoples in Canada, disproportionately affected by overdose deaths. And this is all linked to the ongoing impacts of colonialism in our horrific residential school system, which the Pope has recently apologized for the role of the church in that horrific abuse, which has passed on this intergenerational trauma. So these issues are all very much linked together.
Is there not a risk, though, that people will still turn to these contaminated drugs because they are perhaps cheaper?
Yeah, I looked at that. I mean, that's a concern. Like I said, I have young children. These contaminated drugs that are on the street right now are cheaper. So that's what the global war on drugs did. As literally hundreds of tons of cocaine and heroin were seized globally, organized crime did not pack up their bags and go home from conflict zones like Colombia and Afghanistan, where those are primarily produced. They discovered a synthetic drug created in the 1950s for palliative cancer care patients, actually, called fentanyl. You can make it with basic college chemistry equipment and supplies, and it can be produced anywhere in the world cheaply, easily, and it's more potent. So that's what we got. We got more potent, cheaper drugs with a toxic street drug supply through the war on drugs.
Okay.
In terms of incentives to not use, I mean, everyone in our province understands at this point using drugs is like rolling the dice. And if the risk of overdosing and dying isn't an incentive enough to not use, the prospect of getting a criminal record and perhaps going to jail for a few months is not, it's not a thing.
Just in a sentence, can I ask, do you think the rest of Canada is going to follow suit on this?
Well, it's really interesting because 3/4 of all illicit drug deaths in Canada are actually outside of BC. This is a national opioid crisis in our country. And it strikes me that the 4 provinces that have the biggest per capita death rates, which are BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, you look at which of those are calling for decriminalizing drugs, which provincial governments, it's the progressive left-wing government in British Columbia. The others have right-wing conservative governments. So one of the criticisms of this actually is it doesn't go far enough. It should be done on a national basis. And other cities have already applied for exemptions from these drug laws for simple possession. That's what we're talking about. It would not be legal. We still have laws against other drug things, but this is about people possessing small quantities. So the city of Toronto, the city of Montreal, the city of Edmonton are all at various stages of either having applied for or considering applying for this. We don't believe that it should be a buffet choice. We think that all Canadians deserve to be treated with compassion and to follow the evidence, which is that criminalizing them kills.
Okay, Ben Perrin at the University of British Columbia, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. Thank you.